This is Indian Country Today.
Esquili, yes, thank you for joining us. I'm Patty Thalahungva. When it comes to Native cultures, language, health, and history, technology can be key to improving all of these areas and more. The Massachusetts Institute of Technology, or MIT, is rewarding some natives for being innovative and tackling these issues. They just announced the third annual class of Indigenous Communities Fellows, and there are 8 altogether, and we are featuring 4, and they are going to participate in a 9-month program and split more than $100,000 in funding. Joining us today is Ava Burke, and her project is all about food. Welcome, Ava.
Hello, thank you for having me. It's great to be here today.
And Austin Serio is tackling the issue of mental health with an app called Shock Talk. Welcome, Austin.
Hi, thank you for having me. It's great to be here today.
And Elizabeth Rule has an app that will show you a whole different side to Washington, D.C. called Indigenous DC. Welcome, Elizabeth.
Thank you for having me. It's great to be here.
And finally, Michael Running Wolf. His project focuses on language. Welcome, Michael.
Thank you. Thank you for inviting me here.
Absolutely. Well, let's start with you, Michael. Your app is called the International Waukeshan AI Consortium Project.
Yes. So my proposal and project is to build automatic speech recognition for using AI technologies for the Waukeshan language family. The language family is peoples that are traditionally in the northwestern part of the United States and the southwestern part of Canada. So they're on the Vancouver Island and on the most western point of Washington State.
And it's interesting because in your description of your project, you talk about the 49th parallel and how that created this international boundary. Quite often you hear in Indian country, you know, the borders crossed us. We didn't cross the borders. And that's certainly the case there for the people who live in that area that you describe in the Pacific Northwest, who now find themselves in 2 different countries. And one of the ways that traditional ways that they kept in touch was, you know, going back and forth in canoes. How did the canoe journey actually help you with your project?
Actually, it helped us a great deal. So they do still maintain the tradition of the canoe journey, a yearly journey. And so we were originally started working with the Kwakwala based in Vancouver Island in BC, British Columbia. And we wanted to expand our project to also include more peoples of this language family, and that's how we were able to connect through the canoe journey. So friends and family, through our contacts in the Kwakwala, which is the Waukeshan, put us in touch with the Makah. And the Makah were very interested in working with us because of course, it's important, and we needed this cooperation because of data. We're building artificial intelligence, and we need a lot of training data, particularly for speech recognition. Typically for something like Siri or Google Assistant, they use over 1 million hours of annotated audio, and we just don't have that. And so we were just trying to cobble together and pull together this consortium between like-minded similar speaking languages, and to build this AI to kind of like sort of maximize their effect.
Okay, and I have to admit that when I read your description, I had to go to the dictionary myself and look up some of these words, because I was thinking, you know, what does this mean? So explain, when you're talking about these sounds and the languages, the words, what is the polysynthetic language, and how are you working with that to create this, collect this artificial, or create this information to create that artificial intelligence?
Yeah, so our project is really very much an applied scientific project. We expect to actually make scientific progress because, for one, current automatic speech recognition systems kind of expect all languages to be similar to English. And what I mean is that they are atomic, like each word is its own subcomponent, its own, like, there's only one word for anything, like car or snow, for example. Versus indigenous languages, there's that old stereotype that Eskimos have 28 words for snow. And actually, that's just a complete mischaracterization. What they mean is that there's one concept of snow, which is a morpheme, and they have 28 variations. And in fact, 28 is probably too low because you can modify this morpheme with other morphemes and create an infinite amount of words. And so polysynthetic languages do this all across their verbs, or it depends on the language, of course. But and so what it means is that polysynthetic languages don't have a discrete finite dictionary or a dictionary that you can print. Basically, the dictionary for a polysynthetic language would be infinite in size. So every word comprises the same amount of information as a phrase in English. So basically, imagine taking a phrase in English and turning it into a word, and you have this very information dense phrases. So you have so indigenous languages, and this is quite common in North America, have this extremely information dense languages. So you have phrases embedded in words, and then you have entire phrases composed of this. And so you can very efficiently communicate concepts and complexities. And unfortunately, modern ASR technology does not address this issue. It causes complications because current ASRs assume that you have a finite dictionary.
It's so interesting when you look at our traditional languages and see that. And of course, people who speak it or understand, or at least have that framework of understanding an indigenous language, they get that. But trying to apply it to, as you mentioned, other technology that relies on the English language, it just doesn't make sense. And so how are you trying to make sense out of all of this? Now, the other thing that's very interesting is there are very few Makah language speakers as compared to the Kwakwala in Canada.
Yes. So which is, like I mentioned it earlier, is the reason why we're pulling together multiple tribes within this family is that there is a problem of not enough speakers. So we're trying to build a data set. So ultimately, the goal is to create more speakers. So we're not building AI simply as a scientific experiment. We're actually doing this simply because we're trying to build tools for language education. And because there's only 16 fluent speakers, this is a problem of data. Fortunately, though, Wakashan languages are scientifically interesting, and so they have a lot of a backlog of archival audio and a relatively large corpus or data set, basically tapes. Anthropologists and linguists have collected a fair amount of body of work and have documented these languages. And so we have a benefit of a historical data, and which is also why we're approaching the Wakashan and not any other languages in North America. Like any other languages would have the same issues that I mentioned earlier, but the Wakashan languages are fortunate enough to have a very deep scientific research done on them by the linguistic community.
Well, we'll come back to you in just a little bit here. It's just really interesting to see again how you are using technology to basically understand this native language and then to create more language speakers. Another area that's really important is food. And Ava, you also have a project here called Food from Fire. Tell us a little bit about that and what drove you to tackle this particular issue.
Yes. So in Alaska, 95% of our food is imported, and most of our communities are off the road system. So most of our communities receive the majority of their food via air. The other issue that we're having is climate change is affecting our traditional food, as well as just contemporary lifestyles. Harvesting and preparing food has to be part of everyday life. And so a few years ago, I started to revitalize fish camps on the Yukon River and Tanana River. And we built a couple fish wheels, and I started to see the way that the community was coming together and that people were very interested in learning how to harvest traditional foods, but how to prepare them and preserve them as well. And then there's a few of our villages who actually were taking things to the next step and looking at agriculture. historically, around the turn of the century, so early 1900s in Alaska, many of the villages had gardens, and that was typical common practice. And we've fallen out of that practice. And so really this is revitalizing foods, whether it's agriculture or traditional foods. And the biomass greenhouses came about because they're the winter is so long in Alaska, where I'm at in the interior, it's 9 months. And so, to be able to supply the needs during that amount of time, we have to be thinking about growing year round. And in Alaska, our energy and electricity costs are off the chart. In many of our rural communities, the heat is actually subsidized. And so where we can look at renewable energy for heat or electricity, these biomass greenhouses will need both heat and electricity. And so there's a few villages who started off building them, and they worked with the local schools, and it just took off in these villages, and they started to be able to sell the produce that they were growing in these greenhouses to the local stores, to local restaurants. The kids were coming in, it was part of their curriculum. And so the whole community was coming together to address food security in the village. And so we've got a couple really strong examples of greenhouses that are working in Alaska right now.
That sounds really incredible. And just to see that, that it is possible to grow other foods there. What kinds of foods, when you talk about indigenous foods, but probably today there are some introduced, maybe produce or something like that, that people want to grow. Are you focusing on anything in particular?
On the type of crops, we are soup people, and then hardy crops, right? You want things that store well, and you want things that can handle a little bit of frost. So you want to choose the things carefully. And from the initial research and what people are doing, potatoes, carrots, onions, turnips, kale actually grows quite well. Strawberries is another big one. We have berry farms up here. And so the greenhouse is one part of it, because you can do the greenhouse year round, or you can use the greenhouse to extend your shoulder seasons. And so you can start to get crops ready for the summer. And so many of the crops, because each design has to be carefully planned for each community's needs. And so it'll vary from village to village.
Well, we'll come back to you too and talk a little bit more about who you're working with in this project here. But let me turn to Austin. And Austin, your project tackles mental health. It tackles it's an area that a lot of people are, they struggle with. So your app is called Shock Talk. Tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, so Shock Talk is really focused on delivering culturally appropriate healthcare for Native American and Alaska Native communities. So I'm a member of the Chakorn-Chakri tribe, which is based in South Carolina. So I'm calling in from Connecticut because my ancestors left South Carolina during the Great Migration, and they came up north for the good union jobs. They were sharecroppers, and they left a place called the Dimri settlement. And so my family, when we came up here, my mom is a nurse. She was the first person in our family to rise above sharecropping and to be able to go to college. And so, having a strong healthcare background, I could see, as someone who's a member of an unrecognized nation, how much we've really just fallen through all of the cracks in the system, which isn't to mention, again, the cracks, that Native people are facing with culturally appropriate healthcare that's been intentionally underfunded by the Indian Health Service. So we know that Natives are, the only group with the legal right to healthcare. We know that the guarantee is there, but it hasn't been realized. And that's very intentional. And so Shock Talk came about when I first met my partner, Sutton King, who's the co-founder of Urban Indigenous Collective. She founded Urban Indigenous Collective while she was at NYU, and we met through the NYU Native Students group. And so we got to talking about, these challenges that we've both seen as urban natives, the challenges that Urban Indigenous Collective is trying to address in the tri-state area. And that's where we really, saw the need for this culturally tailored telehealth platform.
This is Shock Talk. Shock Talk is a virtual safe space that connects self-identifying Native American and Alaska Natives to social support, telebehavioral, and mental health resources grounded in cultural humility. Shock Talk aims to decrease adverse mental health effects by focusing on healing unresolved historical and intergenerational trauma through increasing access to culturally appropriate services, resources, and content.
One day I was walking down the street to my job in Lower Manhattan, and I actually bumped into another Shakari person who was living with Sutton's ancestors. That Shakari person was living amongst the Haudenosaunee, and so we found out some of our ancestors had actually been invited to join the world's oldest continuing democracy, which we know the US government is based off of. So once we found that, that person identified themselves as Sisbaha. Sisbaha people, according to Western anthropologists, were politically defunct by the time of European arrival. My band, the Shakur and Shakari, are not supposed to be around at all. So it's really clear that the Western system has gotten a lot of things wrong. And we know that so many Indigenous communities are paying the price. And so we know that that price is being expressed through the mental health crisis, excuse me. And so we are really looking forward to, addressing that in a meaningful way, ideally once and for all.
You raised a lot of really good points there in talking about, the mental health, the state of mental health for Native Americans. And you consider the historical trauma that we've been through, in, as you mentioned, your tribe in particular. So, how does that tie back to sovereignty? How does that identity tie back to sovereignty? And what are the issues when it comes to being erased as an entire race of people? And I think all of your projects talk about that idea of sovereignty, whether it's within your own mental health, whether it's within your food system, or whether it's within your language here. And that's, I think, a part of your project, Michael, that talks about the data being sacred and that the people who you are working with will control that data. Explain a little bit more about that.
Okay, so one of the main components, so we're bridging four main components here. We have linguistics, we have science, and we also have machine computers. But we're also bridging this with the community at the center of all this. And the community, when we're looking at their archival data for Indigenous communities, we're often under-resourced. So you're thinking about data from the 1960s and 70s and 80s, and typically it's by people who are trying to preserve the most important information for their tribe or their community. And typically this is the voices of their elders who have long since passed or given knowledge that their sacred stories that are important to their society. And this is our raw data that we're using to build this automatic speech recognition, this AI. And so there's an intrinsic value here that has intellectual property value in the Western space, but also value to the community. And it's really important that we preserve and protect their rules. For instance, for the Kwagwala, they have certain stories that can't be told only in portion. Like you can't just give the first part today and the next part tomorrow. You have to tell the entire story through the whole, through its end to end in one sitting. What this means for us is that what we do is we take training data and test data and randomly distribute them between two to build the AI as part of the machine learning process. The practical ramifications that if we treat the AI like an entity, then what we would do is make sure that story stays either in the test or in the training set. And so there are practical applications to Indigenous data sovereignty to our process.
And you know, when you talk about the project and your, you know, what the applications it can have in the future, you describe how, you know, Siri or Alexa speaks English or other, maybe Spanish and other languages, but one day actually having them speak a native language.
Yeah, I think it's totally feasible within the next 5 to 10 years. And I think it's also really important that we as Indigenous peoples conduct this research ourselves, like as part of our mission and working with the Waukeshan peoples and the Makah and Kwakwala and others, is that we're teaching them the basics. We're teaching them basic linguistics to understand from a scientific perspective their own language, and we're also teaching them basic software engineer, and I'm teaching them that. And we also have a mathematician, our data scientist. We're teaching them the basic math. Like, our hope is that this is just the first step to a long journey as they make kin with artificial intelligence.
All right, but it's exciting to think about that, and again, you know, just how each one of you are looking at technology and finding ways to improve these areas of food, of language, of health, you know, and also of place. And Elizabeth, that's what your app does. Looking at Washington, D.C. and seeing it from a Piscataway point of view. Give us a little bit of an example of your app.
Absolutely. So in July 2019, I launched the Guide to Indigenous DC, which is a completely free and publicly facing iOS mobile application. And really, what I wanted to do when I set out to create this application was map 17 sites of what I call Indigenous importance. And so these are a combination of historically relevant sites as well as contemporary sites of Indigenous importance. They range in subject matter from everything from, you know, national federal monuments to sites of Indigenous activism, Indigenous artworks, and so on. So because of the breadth and depth of the subject material, my hope is that the Guide to Indigenous DC will be able to serve as an educational resource for everyone, K through 12 audiences, folks that live in the DC area, the millions of tourists who visit our nation's capital every year, but also, of course, that it serves both the Indigenous community that calls DC home and the many Native people, including myself, who come from tribes from elsewhere, but who live in DC to do Indigenous advocacy work.
All right, and you're also are looking at expanding this app to cover other cities, right?
That's absolutely right. So right now I'm working to create a guide to Indigenous Baltimore, and I'm finalizing a guide to tribal colleges and universities. Both of these are different, of course, in scope. One's national, and one is another city just up the road from us in DC. But I'm also expanding to work with other additional partners as well. So I've had states approach me wanting to do statewide maps and apps, universities that want to discover the Indigenous history of the land that they're built upon, and also, of course, tribal nations who can deploy this type of technology for cultural heritage preservation, economic development, whatever their specific need is.
It's really exciting to see again how this technology is helping out in all of these areas. I know there is a tribe in North Dakota that has a tourist a tour of their, when you drive through their homelands, and you can download the app and listen to it in your car as you're driving through. So they tell you their own history. They share with you that information. So Elizabeth, I want to say thank you so much for joining us today and telling us about your project. Thank you.
Thank you for having me.
And Michael, you know, your project with the language preservation, and not just so much preservation, but the use of that language, that has effect. That can have an effect for the next, 10 years to 100 years. And so that will be very exciting, I think, to watch as your language app develops and people use that.
Yes, thank you. I think this is just the first step. This is one of many steps toward language-based technology. There's several components that we're not addressing in language AI. We're just doing the automatic speech recognition, which is sort of the input. And then there's a whole body of work that needs to be done for natural language understanding what the speaker said. And then, of course, the output, the text to speech. we're focusing on the most critical, actually the most difficult component, um, to make it more interactive. And it's just honestly, it's a baby step. This is language AI for a community is probably akin to a space program because of all the technical difficulties. And our goal is to actually develop pedagogy that respects Indigenous sovereignty and methodologies that enable other tribes to do this for themselves. My hope is that we have a ton of copycatters once we get up and running.
I think you will. Yes. Ava Burke, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you, Basi. Thank you for having me.
And Michael Running Wolf, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for inviting me.
And also Elizabeth Rule, thank you so much for joining us, Elizabeth.
Thank you for having me this evening and sharing the Guide to Indigenous DC.
Very good. And Austin Serio, thank you so much for joining us, Austin.
Hello, Hook, and thank you for having me.
And congratulations to each one of you on your MIT fellowships. And thank you for watching. Take care of yourselves. Your life is precious. I'm Patty Thalohungva. Join us again tomorrow.
Indian Country Today is recorded at the Phoenix Indian School Visitor Center in Phoenix, Arizona.
This is Indian Country Today.